I never imagined the day would come when I would have to face the truth about my son and daughter-in-law. I had raised my son to be kind, responsible, and compassionate, but somewhere along the way, he had turned into someone I barely recognized. And it wasn't just his behavior toward me. It was how he treated my dog, Max, that made me realize how far things had fallen. Max had been my companion through thick and thin. He was always there, whether I was dealing with the loneliness after my husband passed away or when the weight of life seemed too much to bear. Max was my comfort, my protector, and my friend. He had seen me at my lowest and had never judged me. His loyalty was unmatched, and I couldn't imagine life without him. The days that followed that fateful moment in the garden were a blur of frustration and simmering anger. But there was also a strange sense of calm. I knew what I had to do. I had to make them face the reality of their actions, and I would do it in a way that left no room for excuses. This wasn't just about punishment. It was about making them understand the true meaning of responsibility, respect, and love. Max was my responsibility, and I had failed him for far too long. The conversation that had taken place in the garden was far from over. I could tell by the way my son avoided my gaze in the days that followed that he was starting to feel the weight of my words. He was a proud man, and even though I knew he still tried to downplay his role in the abuse, the guilt was starting to settle in. But it wasn't enough for me. I wanted him to feel the depth of his betrayal, to understand how deeply he had wronged Max and me. I had to be strategic. I wasn't going to let him off so easily. It wasn't just about forcing an apology. No, I needed him to truly comprehend the consequences of his actions. The way he had treated Max, my loyal dog, who had been nothing but a source of comfort for me, was unforgivable. I had raised him better than that. I had taught him to love, to care, to respect. And he had thrown all that away, all for the sake of convenience and laziness. The days after our confrontation felt tense. My son and his wife came over, but they kept their distance. I could tell they were both uncomfortable in my presence. And though I had hoped for a genuine apology, all I got from them were half-hearted attempts to move past the issue. But I wasn't going to let them sweep it under the rug. Not this time. I began to gather evidence, going over the past few years with a fine-tooth comb. I remembered the countless times I had turned a blind eye to their behavior. The times I had brushed off their dismissive comments about Max, the times I had excused their neglect and cruelty because they were too busy or under too much stress. But this was no longer about excuses. This was about accountability. It was time to take action. I spoke to the neighbors, the ones who had witnessed the way Max was treated. At first, they were hesitant to speak out. They had seen my son and daughter-in-law's behavior firsthand, but they didn't want to get involved. It wasn't until I explained that this wasn't just about a dog, it was about what kind of people they were, that they began to come forward. Slowly but surely, I built my case. I even started documenting Max's behavior, how he would cower when my son entered the room, how he would tremble in fear every time Danielle raised her voice. It was heartbreaking, but I had to do it. I needed to ensure that when the time came, there would be no room for them to deny the truth. And then came the day I would finally put my plan into action. It was a regular Sunday afternoon when they came to visit. My son walked in with his usual charm, flashing that smile that had always made me believe he was the good guy, the responsible one. Danielle, on the other hand, was distant, her eyes shifting nervously between me and the door. I could tell she was nervous. But why? She had nothing to fear, right? "Hey, Mom," my son said, his voice still as carefree as ever. "How are you doing?" "Fine," I replied, my tone as flat as I could make it. I wasn't about to let him think that everything was okay. I wasn't going to let him off the hook this time, not when I had everything I needed. I excused myself to the back room. I had a plan, and I wasn't going to waste any more time. I had to make them see the truth. I had to make them feel the same fear and guilt that Max had lived with every day. And then, just like I promised, they would beg for mercy. As I walked into the room, Max was lying on his bed, his eyes still weary, his tail wagging faintly when he saw me. His trust in me had never wavered, even after all he had been through. I knelt beside him, petting his fur, feeling the weight of my promise to him. I called my son and Danielle into the room. They followed reluctantly, both of them confused, unsure of what was coming next. They stood in the doorway, their eyes scanning the room, but they weren't prepared for what they were about to see. I turned to face them, and for a moment, I could see the fear in their eyes. They knew. They knew that this was no longer something they could ignore. "Look at him," I said, my voice calm but carrying the weight of everything I had been holding back. "Look at what you've done. This is not just a dog. This is a living being who trusted you both, and this is what you've done to him." I paused, letting the silence settle between us. The air was thick with tension, and I knew they could feel it. I didn't wait for them to respond. I was done with their excuses. "You will apologize to him," I said, my voice firm. "Not to me, not to anyone else. You will apologize to Max for every moment you've made him suffer, and you will beg for his forgiveness." To my surprise, my son didn't protest. Instead, he stood there, silently, his face pale as he watched me. It was clear that he was starting to feel the weight of the situation. Danielle, on the other hand, was another story. She crossed her arms defensively and looked away, clearly angry but also afraid. "I'm not apologizing to a dog," she spat, her voice dripping with disdain. "This is ridiculous." But I wasn't backing down. "You'll apologize, and you'll do it in front of me. You'll understand what it feels like to be powerless, to feel small." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence as my son looked at me, his expression slowly changing. His anger melted into something else, guilt, regret, maybe even shame. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hurt him. I didn't know." Danielle muttered something under her breath, her voice filled with bitterness. "Fine, sorry, Max." It wasn't enough, it wasn't genuine, but it was a start. I stood up, my gaze never leaving them. "You'll remember this," I said coldly. "You'll remember what it feels like to beg for forgiveness. And you'll never forget the pain you caused." And with that, I left the room, leaving them to their guilt. Max followed me out, his head held high, and I couldn't help but smile. I had made my point. They would never treat him or me the same again. But over time, I began to notice the subtle signs of abuse. Max's once glowing coat became dull, his eyes dimmed with a sadness that was hard to ignore. He used to run to the door when he heard my son's car pull up, wagging his tail, eager to greet him, but lately he had been retreating to the far corners of the house. The joy was gone from his steps. I kept telling myself I was imagining things. Maybe Max was just getting older, or perhaps it was just the stress of living in a household with a growing family. But deep down, I knew better. The little things that my son and daughter-in-law did, screaming at Max when he was simply trying to get their attention, locking him outside for hours in the cold, ignoring his needs, were starting to take a toll. I could feel the guilt creeping up inside me, knowing I had let it go on for too long. But it wasn't until one particular evening that I realized just how bad it had gotten. Max came to me, his fur matted with dirt, his body trembling as if he had been beaten. His eyes, once so full of life, were now dull and filled with fear. I could barely hold back my tears as I knelt down to comfort him. But it wasn't just the physical state of Max that broke my heart. It was the fear in his eyes, the fear that came from a lifetime of mistreatment. I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to act. I wasn't just a passive observer in this situation, I was his protector. I would no longer stand by and let my son and daughter-in-law treat him like this. Something had to change, and I was going to make sure it did. That night, I made a decision. I was going to confront them. I had been quiet for too long, letting my son's excuses and his wife's manipulations cloud my judgment. But not anymore. I was going to make them see what they had done to Max. I would make them realize the weight of their cruelty, and I would make them regret every moment they had made my dog suffer. The next morning, I started preparing. I knew I couldn't just let my emotions drive my actions. This had to be strategic. I needed evidence, something that would force them to acknowledge the truth. I began documenting every instance of abuse I had witnessed, every time I had seen Max treated cruelly. I spoke to the neighbors, the ones who had seen everything but were too afraid to speak up. One by one, they came forward, telling me how they had seen my son and daughter-in-law push Max away, yell at him, and lock him out of the house. I knew it wasn't enough to just have the facts. I had to confront them in a way that would leave no room for denial. I wasn't going to let them get away with it anymore. The plan was set, and I would carry it out without hesitation. That evening, they came over for a visit just like they always did, pretending everything was fine. My son, always so charming, smiled at me and complimented my house. Danielle, his wife, was as sweet as ever, pretending that nothing had changed. But inside, I was seething. The tension between us was thick, like a simmering pot about to boil over. I excused myself and walked toward the back door, where Max was resting in his usual spot. The moment he saw me, he got up and came running toward me, wagging his tail with the same eagerness he had shown when he was a puppy. But there was something different in his eyes this time, trust. He trusted me to fix this, to make it right. I stepped outside and they followed me, still unaware of what I had planned. I opened the door to the backyard, where Max stood, shaking but looking up at me, waiting for my direction. I turned to my son and Danielle, who had now joined me in the garden. My voice was calm, but it carried the weight of years of pent-up emotion. "You've done this to him," I said, my gaze never leaving their faces. "You've hurt him in ways you can't even begin to understand. I've stayed silent for far too long, but not anymore. You will both beg for his mercy, and then you will know what true regret feels like." The shock on their faces was almost too much to bear. My son looked at me, then at Max, confusion written all over his face. Danielle's face was flushed with guilt, but she quickly masked it with anger. "I'm not apologizing to a dog," Danielle snapped, her voice dripping with disdain. But I wasn't backing down. "You will," I said firmly. "You will apologize, and you will beg for his forgiveness." In the days that followed the apology, I watched my son and his wife with new eyes. They couldn't look me in the eye without flinching, as if the weight of their guilt was too much to bear. And it wasn't just about the dog anymore. It was about their actions, their disregard for everything I had taught them. It was about their betrayal of the trust I had placed in them as family, as people I loved and thought I could depend on. Max was still my first priority. His trust in me had been unshakable, but now, with everything that had happened, I knew it was time to take further action. The apology wasn't enough. I could feel the tension in the air between us all, like an invisible barrier that had formed, a wall that could never be torn down until they truly understood the full scope of their wrongs. I had to make sure that the lesson I was teaching wasn't lost, so I waited, I watched, and I bided my time. One thing I knew for sure was that nothing in this world, nothing, would make me forgive them easily. The constant neglect, the abuse, the cruelty, it would never leave my mind, and no matter how much they tried to brush it off with a few words, I knew in my heart that they hadn't learned anything. Max deserved better. I had to show them what it meant to truly care, to show respect, not just with words, but with actions. And the truth was, I had to make them face the consequences of their lack of empathy. I needed them to feel the weight of their selfishness, to understand that no one was above accountability. One afternoon, when the house felt suffocating with the silence between us, my son called. He asked if I was free to talk. He sounded genuine, something I hadn't heard from him in years. I could tell he was trying, perhaps for the first time, to acknowledge the wrongs. I agreed to meet him. He came to my house, his usual confidence replaced by something else, something I hadn't seen in him before. Perhaps it was fear, or maybe it was guilt finally catching up with him. He arrived alone, no sign of Danielle, and I knew deep down that this moment would determine everything. "Mom," he began, standing at the entrance of the living room, hands nervously clasped together. "I've been thinking about what you said. I know I can't undo what's been done, but I want to make it right. I really do." His words were slow, measured. They were an attempt, however small, to regain some of the respect he had lost. But for me, it wasn't enough. He was still the same person, the same son who had allowed his wife to manipulate him, who had ignored my pleas for help. The apology was a start, yes, but it wasn't the answer. "Apologies are a start," I said, my voice calm but firm. "But they mean nothing without change. You can't just say the words and expect me to forget everything. You can't just expect me to forget how you treated Max, how you treated me." I saw him wince at the mention of the dog's name, but I wasn't done yet. You have to prove to me that you've learned, that you've changed, I added, locking eyes with him. And that change won't come from half-hearted words or empty gestures. It will come from you making things right. For a moment, he didn't say anything. He stood there, silent, as if weighing my words carefully. Finally, he sat down across from me, his gaze now more intense. I know, he whispered. I know I've messed up. I don't expect things to go back to how they were before. I just want a chance to fix it. I don't know where to start, but I'm willing to try. I nodded, acknowledging his effort, but I still felt that same emptiness. He wanted to fix it, sure, but was it because he was genuinely remorseful? Or was he just tired of feeling like the villain? You're going to prove your change, then, I said slowly. You're going to spend the next week with Max. You'll take care of him, clean up after him, feed him, and give him the attention you've denied him all this time. You're going to show Max, that you understand how much he's been through. His face hardened, and for a split second, I saw the defensive son I knew all too well. But Mom, that's not necessary. I've apologized, haven't I? I don't need to go through all this, he said, his tone sharp. No, I responded sharply, my voice unwavering. You're going to do this, and I'm going to watch. You'll care for him the way he should have been cared for all these years. You'll prove to me that you mean what you say. Only then will I even consider moving forward. Only then will I believe that you understand the consequences of your actions. The silence in the room was thick. He didn't speak for a long while, and then, finally, he sighed heavily, shoulders slumping in defeat. Fine, he said quietly. I'll do it. I'll do whatever it takes. For the first time in years, I saw the tiniest glimmer of something resembling genuine remorse in my son's eyes. But was it enough? Was it enough to erase all the pain, all the years of neglect? I wasn't sure. The next morning, he arrived at my house, and I led him to Max's resting spot in the garden. Max stood up as soon as he saw us, his tail wagging cautiously. He was still uncertain, still scared of my son after everything he'd endured. But I could see something in his eyes, a flicker of hope. I'll take it from here, my son said, kneeling down beside Max. I stayed back, watching. He didn't move for a moment, just stared at Max, unsure of where to begin. The silence stretched, and I wondered if he could really do it. Could he really care for the dog the way I had asked? It was only when Max nudged his hand with a gentle snout that something in my son seemed to shift. Slowly, almost tentatively, he reached out, stroking Max's head. For the first time in a long while, I felt the tiniest bit of relief. Maybe, just maybe, my son could find his way back to the right path. But I wasn't finished yet, not by a long shot. As the days passed, I watched my son's attempts with a watchful eye. He spent time with Max, feeding him, taking him on walks, and even cleaning up after him, tasks that had once seemed beneath him. It was as though he was trying to prove to me that he was capable of understanding the responsibilities he had failed to see for so long. Yet, deep down, I knew the truth. This was still a test, when he needed to pass to show me he had truly changed. But it wasn't just Max that needed his attention. It was his attitude, his sense of entitlement, and his inability to take full responsibility for the damage he had caused. I had told him that an apology wasn't enough, but I could see in his actions that he was still struggling to grasp the full weight of what he had done. I had grown tired of waiting. Time was running out, and I couldn't afford to let him slip away with half measures anymore. So, I devised the final test, the moment that would force him and his wife to confront not just their guilt, but the consequences of their behavior. It all started with an invitation to dinner. I called my son and Danielle, asking them to come over one evening for a meal. It was a simple request, one that seemed harmless enough. What they didn't know was that this dinner would be the final step in my plan. When they arrived, they were still playing the same role they had for years, pretending everything was fine, acting like the loving couple they thought they could fool me into believing. I saw through their charade immediately. I could tell that Danielle, in particular, was still playing the victim, still trying to manipulate the situation. But I wasn't having it anymore. I had seen their true colors, and it was time for them to face the music. The dinner went on, with small talk filling the awkward silence. Max was there, of course, lounging by my side. The tension in the room grew as I set the stage, building the atmosphere to a boiling point. I had planned this carefully, every move calculated to make them confront the reality of their actions. After dinner, I cleared the table, offering to make coffee for everyone. But before I left the room, I turned to my son and Danielle and made sure to look them both in the eye. "I have something I need to show you," I said, my voice calm, yet carrying a weight they couldn't ignore. "Something you need to see." Their faces paled at my words, but neither one of them spoke. They followed me to the living room, where Max was lying quietly. The air was thick with anticipation, with the unspoken understanding that something was about to happen that they weren't prepared for. When I entered the room, I turned to face them. "I'm done with your excuses," I said, my voice firm. "You both know what you've done. You both know the pain you've caused, not just to Max, but to me, to our family. And you've never truly taken responsibility for it." The silence between us was unbearable. My son looked at me, trying to speak, but I cut him off. "No more pretending," I continued, my tone hard. "No more excuses. Tonight, you will both prove that you understand the gravity of what you've done." I nodded toward Max, who had been sitting patiently by my side. He looked up at them, his gentle eyes filled with quiet trust. There was something in his gaze, a quiet hope that they might finally understand what they had done. "This is your final test," I said, turning to my son and his wife. "You'll apologize again, not to me this time, not to anyone else, but to Max. You will get down on your knees and beg for his forgiveness, and you will do it sincerely, or else there will be no going back." Danielle's face flushed with anger, her eyes narrowing, but I could see the hesitation in her posture. She didn't want to do this, didn't want to acknowledge the truth that she had been part of the cruelty, but she knew she had no choice. My son, on the other hand, stood frozen, caught in the tension of the moment. I could see the resistance in his eyes, the reluctance to admit his guilt, to face the consequences of his actions. But deep down, I could see the realization slowly dawning on him. This wasn't just a game anymore. This wasn't about avoiding the uncomfortable truth. This was about owning up to the damage he had caused, about taking responsibility. I waited, watching them both carefully. The room seemed to close in on us as the weight of the silence pressed down. The ball was in their court now, and it was their turn to show me that they had truly changed, that they had learned their lesson. I watched my son kneel first, hesitantly at first, but with increasing sincerity. His voice cracked as he spoke. I'm sorry, Max," he said, his voice barely audible. "I didn't understand, I didn't see it. I didn't see what you were going through. I'm so sorry." The words were weak, but they were a start. I nodded, but I wasn't satisfied yet. Danielle, standing behind him, sighed deeply. She walked forward, not without an air of reluctant submission, and dropped to her knees beside my son. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "I'm sorry too, Max," she muttered, her tone heavy with shame. I should have treated you better. I don't know why I let it go on for so long." I stood there, my arms crossed, waiting for something more, waiting for them to show me that they truly meant their apologies. And then my son looked up at me, his eyes red, his expression defeated. "I'll do better, Mom," he said, his voice filled with regret. "I'll take care of him. I'll be a better person." Danielle, her eyes still downcast, nodded along. "We'll do better, I promise." But I wasn't done yet. I walked forward, standing between them and Max, who had remained still, his tail wagging ever so slightly. I smiled, the faintest hint of satisfaction curling at the corners of my lips. This was the beginning of their redemption. "You've taken the first step," I said, my voice steady. "But now you'll show me your actions speak louder than words. You'll prove to me that you understand what true responsibility means. This is just the start. The road to redemption is long." And in that moment, I knew that my son and his wife had begun to understand, however reluctantly, that the price of their actions was far greater than they had ever imagined. The apology was complete, but the journey to true forgiveness had just begun. The silence that followed their apologies was deafening, each second stretching out longer than the last. I stood there, still not fully satisfied, watching them, waiting for something more, something genuine. The weight of their actions hung heavy in the room, and I wasn't about to let them off with mere words. I needed to see a transformation in their hearts, to feel a true change in their behavior. Max, the dog who had been the source of all this turmoil, was still sitting quietly beside me. His tail gave a small wag as he looked up at my son and daughter-in-law, but his eyes, those soulful eyes, were filled with a quiet wisdom. He knew the game. He had seen it all, the lies, the cruelty, the empty promises. And unlike me, he didn't need words to know who was truly sincere. He would never forget what had happened, but the question remained. Could they? For a long moment, none of us spoke. My son, still on his knees, seemed to wait for my approval, as though some invisible force was keeping him there. Danielle, equally humbled, kept her gaze down, the weight of her shame now far more apparent than it had been just moments ago. They were both waiting for me to speak, but I wasn't ready to give them the satisfaction yet. No, the final lesson still had to be taught. "Do you think this is enough?" I asked, my voice steady, though my eyes burned with the fire of all the years of pent-up rage. "Do you think a few words and a couple of kneeled apologies will erase the years of pain, of neglect, of cruelty?" They both shifted uncomfortably at my words, my son opening his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. He closed it again, realizing I wasn't looking for excuses, not this time. "Max doesn't need your words. Max doesn't need your empty promises," I continued, my voice now a little firmer. "What he needs, and what I need, is to see whether you're willing to put your actions where your apologies are." I turned to Max and reached out, my hand brushing his soft fur. "You've been through so much," I whispered, more to myself than to anyone else. "But we've come a long way, haven't we, boy?" Max responded by leaning into me, his head resting gently against my leg. The dog had always been my rock, never wavering, never complaining. He had endured so much, yet his loyalty was unwavering. As I looked at him, the full weight of everything hit me, everything I had fought for, everything that had led to this moment. The reason for my actions wasn't just revenge, it was redemption. For Max, for me, for my son, and for Danielle. The road ahead was long, but this was the only way forward. My son stood up slowly, his body stiff but his posture more humbled than it had ever been. He wasn't the same man who had walked into my house so many weeks ago. His shoulders slumped under the weight of the guilt, and the defiance that had once been so easy for him to wear was gone, replaced with a quiet shame. He met my gaze, his eyes softening. "Mom, I'm sorry, truly. I don't know how to make up for all the years of neglect, all the things I said, but I want to try. I want to be better for Max and for you." I nodded, though my heart was still unsure whether his words could be trusted. This wasn't the end of the journey, but it was a beginning. Danielle, too, stood, her face still flushed with embarrassment, but she looked different now. There was a certain weariness in her eyes, a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. "I've been terrible," she admitted softly, her voice shaking. "And I don't know how to fix it, but I'll try. I'll work on myself and I'll make sure Max is safe, that he's loved." Her words were sincere, and for the first time I could see a glimmer of true remorse in her face. It was small, but it was there. The first flicker of change. I glanced down at Max, who was still leaning against me. His eyes meeting mine with that quiet trust. He had been through so much already, but now, at least for this moment, he was free of the torment. The power had shifted. I had taken control of the situation, forcing them to acknowledge their wrongs. But the true moment of redemption wouldn't come until they had proven it with their actions. I was cautious, yet hopeful. "I will give you both a chance," I said, my voice softer now, though still firm. "But you have to understand that this isn't just about what you've done to Max. This is about the foundation of trust, respect, and love that we've all neglected. I've been blinded by my own love for you, but I can't keep pretending. This isn't just about forgiveness, it's about making the right choices. Do you understand?" They both nodded, their expressions showing the full weight of the responsibility they now carried. My son, who had once been so arrogant, was now bowing his head in silent agreement. Danielle, ever the proud one, was no longer defiant but accepting of the consequences of her actions. "I'll make it right," my son said, his voice low but resolute. "I swear." I stood there for a moment, surveying the scene. The apology had been made, but the true test was yet to come. This was no fairy tale, no magical redemption. They had a long way to go, and I was going to hold them to it. But for now, there was hope. "Good," I said, the finality in my voice carrying the weight of the promise. "Let's see how you both do. But remember, this is only the beginning. If you ever hurt Max again or anyone else, I'll make sure you know the consequences." As they left my house that evening, their heads low in remorse, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of closure. The redemption wasn't instant, but it was possible, and I had made sure that this time it would not come without consequences. Max was safe, and maybe, just maybe, the people I loved could be too.